Please.
Thank you. Thank you. I must apologize for speaking in English parce que ma français est affreux. And also apologize for arriving late because the plane arrived late and so on. So I will try to both speak slowly and just make some general points. And my interest is the activities and policy of the Communist International in relation to Africa and the African diaspora. And I've spent the last 8 years working on this subject in the archives of Britain, France, the US, Russia, some in West Africa, and possibly other places I've forgotten. I can't remember now.
Bon, je m'excuse pour mon retard, le fait que je parle en anglais. Donc je vais faire quelques points en général. Je m'intéresse aux politiques et aux activités du Comintern par rapport à l'Afrique. Et je travaille là-dessus depuis 8 ans. J'ai travaillé dans les archives aux États-Unis, en Russie, en France, en Angleterre et un peu en Afrique.
Et en la Russe.
Et en Russie. Oui.
Ok.
Juste pour l'organisation, est-ce que c'est pas, s'il y a très peu de personnes qui ne comprennent pas l'anglais, est-ce que ce serait pas mieux que tu ailles vers eux et qu'on fasse en simultané? On va gagner beaucoup de temps. Non, je ne sais pas, je pense qu'il y a actuellement peu de personnes qui ne comprennent pas l'anglais.
Ça veut dire que c'est très vite, non?
Non, parce que comme...
Tu veux la faire quoi?
Je peux, si vous voulez.
Ben, je sais pas.
C'est moins efficace.
Qui ne comprend pas l'anglais?
Il y en a qu'un, il a honte de le dire.
Non, mais
on me fera un résumé
avec Sébastien assis à côté de...
Non, non, il n'y a pas de problème. Pas de problème, je ne veux pas entraver le...
Non, mais ça c'est tout à fait possible de se réunir au fond comme ça.
Okay. So the first point I want to make is that the Communist International, I think, alone in this period from 1919 to 1939, I think was the only international organization which took up the question of the liberation of Africa and the liberation of the African diaspora and had a practical program to try and solve this particular problem. It distinguished itself from the Second International, which, although it may have had some policies and some fine words on these questions, practically did nothing. And in fact, during much of its history, many of its parties openly supported colonialism and colonial conquest in Africa and elsewhere. So it was particularly or we can say in particular, the role of Lenin was significant in encouraging the Comintern to take up this question, and also in providing the theoretical orientation for this question to be considered important. And of course it was particularly important because of Lenin's analysis of imperialism and the role of the liberation struggles in Africa and outside of the advanced capitalist countries. So for the first time, if you like, the struggles of people of Africa, the Caribbean, of other parts of the world, as well as the struggles of African Americans and others, was seen as being as important as the struggles of the organized workers of Britain, France, or of the white workers of the US, South Africa, and elsewhere. So this is a very, very important development. Second point is that as I think Ian has mentioned, the Comintern had an uncompromising position in opposition to colonialism, and an uncompromising position in opposition to racism, or what at the time was referred to as white chauvinism. Again, it's almost unique, I think, amongst international organizations of that kind. Again, very different to the Second International and so on. And of course, the part of the 21 conditions which all communist parties adhered to was that they should take up the question of colonial liberation in a practical way. And the fact that they didn't do that led to years of criticism, which I'll mention in a moment. The consequence of the stand of the Comintern, as well as the influence of the Russian Revolution, had an almost immediate impact in Africa, in the Caribbean, amongst African American radicals, and so on. So there was a gravitation, we can say, towards communism and towards the Communist International in the period after the First World War. And in fact, this sympathy between, or this sympathy for communism and the Communist International amongst activists internationally, activists from Africa and from the African diaspora internationally, was maintained itself despite the tardiness of various communist parties to actually implement the policies of the Communist International. So you often had a situation where, for example, African communists in France would be writing to Moscow saying, well, we join the Communist International rather than the Communist Party of France, because the French Communist Party is doing nothing on this question. The Comintern has this policy, etc., etc. So this was a common experience that many, what we could call black communists, or those who were sympathetic, looked to the Communist International for guidance, for support, for intervention, even when the parties in the countries in which they lived and worked were less than enthusiastic for various reasons. The fourth point is that from an early period, the Comintern adopted what I've called a Pan-Africanist approach to this question. It took up what it called at the time the Negro question. Negro question, which first manifested itself in the US as a problem of how were African Americans going to liberate themselves? What role were they playing in the struggle for emancipation generally? This question for the Comintern expanded, so it was not just a question related to the US or South Africa, but the Negro question effectively became a question of how the liberation of the African continent, leaving aside North Africa, the African continent, and those within the African diaspora, how that would take place. The consequence of both the Comintern taking up this question, its attraction for many black activists and so on, was that those black communists who became connected with communist parties often rose to positions of influence rapidly within 3 or 4 years of joining. And I'm particularly thinking of those who were connected with the Communist Party in the US, people like, obviously, George Padmore, James Ford, Harry Haywood, Otto Huiswood, and others, who very, very quickly assumed leading positions not only within their own Communist Party, but also within the international communist movement. These individuals then also began to play a key role in the development of the Comintern's policy on what was called the Negro question. And this was evident particularly from the time of the Fourth Congress, where the policy on the Negro question was first fully developed. and in which people like Otto Huiswood played a leading role, as in fact did the famous Jamaican writer, poet Claude McKay, who was not even an official delegate to the Congress, but took part in it, and had a significant influence on many of the leading figures in the Comintern. The Comintern was also concerned to adopt a policy on the Negro question because it was concerned about the global influence, or certainly international influence, of what it saw as national reformers and misleaders, such as Marcus Garvey being the most notable one, but also others like W.E.B. Du Bois and so on. So the Communist International had a view that the struggles of Africans, those of African descent, was important, that these those from Africa and elsewhere might well be recruited to the armies of the major imperialist countries, particularly France, but also Britain, the US, and so on. And therefore their recruitment, their organization was also important for the safety of the Soviet Union, as well as their struggles being important in their own right. Another thing to say, I think, is that as I've already mentioned, the major communist parties soon came under the spotlight. They were criticized at almost every Congress, certainly up until and including the 6th Congress, for their lack of enthusiasm, both in regard to the anti-colonial struggle, but also in regard to the Negro question and issues of racism and white chauvinism. And by the time of the 6th Congress in 1928, many of the black communists were playing a leading role in this criticism. It was at that Congress that the Communist International developed a policy in regard to 2 countries which has become particularly well known. Firstly, in regard to the Communist Party of South Africa, and secondly, in regard to the Communist Party of the United States. I can go into more detail the nature and the repercussions of these policies. But suffice to say, on the question of the Communist Party of the United States, the policy which was developed was extremely significant in a number of ways. Just to mention 2 things. One is that perhaps for the first time, the Communist Party in the United States began actively organizing in the southern states. It had been predominantly a party of the northern states, particularly as far as African Americans were concerned. After that Congress, it began to develop its work in the southern states. And of course, those of you who've watched Oprah Winfrey's film, or Denzel Washington's film, The Great Debaters, will have seen one of the consequences of that work. And of course, there are others which we can go into. The impact of the Comintern's policy on the US party also had its repercussions elsewhere, particularly in Cuba, but also in regard to Brazil as well. So the Negro question became a key issue in other parties as well, particularly those in, the Cuban party was the only party in the Caribbean, but certainly in South America as well. The criticisms which developed in regard to the major communist parties and their failure to take up this Negro question, as it was called, with sufficient vigor and enthusiasm, also led to the creation of a a special organization which was established in 1928 and which included amongst its ranks many of the leading African American communists or communists, black communists from the US, and that was called the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers. It was a very interesting organization, set up essentially to monitor the activities of the communist parties, to try and improve their performance, their attitude towards this question, to try and find ways of encouraging them, but also finding ways in a way of circumventing them and going directly to Africa, the Caribbean, or certainly working alongside them in these areas, or in areas where there were no communist parties, to try and find solutions to this question. So one of the interesting features then is that this organization was established in 1928, the same time as the Sixth Congress. So as the Comintern entered, or as the world entered, the so-called third period following the First World War, which some people like to criticize, saying the Communist International moved to the left or was too extreme. It was during this period when the Comintern was most active on the question of Africa, the Caribbean, the Negro question in general. Just to mention briefly, I suppose, two features of this organization, which became the main instrument, you could say, of the Communist International on this question. One was that it had, it established very quickly a regular publication called Negro Worker, L'Ouvrier Nègre in French, so it was published in both English and French and distributed widely along with other propaganda material. Of course, as we've already heard, many publications which were issued by the Comintern or by the Profintern and so on were banned in the colonies, and so the International Trade Union Committee from the start had to find ways of smuggling its propaganda into the colonies and established whole networks to do that, utilizing in particular mariners, seafarers, to do that. So it had a wide influence internationally. The second thing which it did was to organize a conference which was held in Hamburg in 1930. The conference was a significant one. First, it was the first, we can say, or the first Pan-African conference. There had been other Pan-African conferences, but the first Pan-African conference based around workers, based on the masses of the people, and again, which took an openly anti-colonial position. It was also a conference which enabled the Comintern to further develop its work, particularly in West Africa, but also in the Caribbean, as well as in countries like Britain, where the activities, the organizing activities for this conference led to a spurt, shall we say, in the Comintern's work on the Negro question. And after this conference, the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers was based and established itself in Hamburg, initially under the leadership of James Ford, who was or who became the American Communist Party candidate for vice president in the US elections, and then under the leadership of George Padmore. Okay, so I've tried to present just some points as to how the Comintern took up this question and tried to find ways of practically organising, both within the communist parties and outside when no communist parties existed. Just briefly to say some of the problems that were experienced in this practical organising. The first problem was that the committee which was established, the International Trade Union Committee, had no members, no affiliates, no mass base, in fact no membership at all, and had very little power, shall we say, in its connections with communist parties or with the sections of the Profintern. It had influence, but it was supposed to work with them. But it was a very strange kind of organisation. We can say it was mainly an agit-prop organisation. It was also an organisation that had no responsibility for the US and little responsibility for South America. So its main activities were concerned with Africa, the Caribbean to some extent, and countries like Britain, France, and so on. It also was an organisation that had few cadres and very limited resources. And in fact, you could say it's amazing that it achieved anything. The organisation of the Hamburg Conference was quite a major achievement, even though there were less than 20 delegates. But it operated in extremely difficult circumstances. It also found it difficult to work with the communist parties in the imperialist countries, the British Party, the French Party, the Belgian Party, as well as others, who, if I give the British Party as an example, it's in fact very difficult to see what the British Party did in regard to this whole question before 1937. The French Party was better, but was also severely criticised for its inactivity. And then the last thing about the difficulties it faced was it faced severe repression. Of course, its life in Germany came to an abrupt end in 1933. It was also expelled from Belgium, and then it was expelled from Holland. Its propaganda, as I've said, was illegal in many places and was regularly confiscated. And many of its sympathisers and activists were arrested or under very, very close surveillance by the security forces. Okay. The work of the Communist International in regard to the Negro question that I've explained did not come to an end at the time of the 7th Congress in 1935, but it definitely underwent a significant change. The main change, of course, had to do with the new tactics of the Comintern, the Popular Front, and so on, but were also the work of the International Trade Union Committee was essentially terminated in 1937. Of course, the Profintern itself had been disbanded because of the new policy. It was also decided that the Pan-Africanist policy, the idea that there was a Negro question which required a policy, also came under renewed scrutiny. And it was considered that this approach was, both this approach and trying to deal with it, solve that problem by organising amongst workers in particular, was unsuitable in the new conditions. And the most significant of those new conditions were the strength of feeling and the many protests and so on which had developed following the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. So there was a kind of mass movement of mass sympathy, particularly amongst Africans, people of African descent. So by 1937, the International Trade Union Committee was disbanded, and it was again left to the communist parties to take up this key question. And in fact, it's interesting that in some cases this is what happened. In regard to the British Party, for example, there was much more developed activities, in fact, after 1937 than there had been before. Okay, so what's the result then of all of this? And again, I'm trying to simplify things. I can go into some of this in more detail if people are interested. Well, I've hinted at some things already. If we take the policy as a whole, that is to say the Comintern's concern with the liberation of Africa and the liberation of Africans, that had undoubtedly had a major impact on, I think, all of the relevant communist parties. I've already said something about the party in the US. In the party in South Africa, of course, by this period had African leadership. It had a completely new orientation. In the early days, its concentration was limited to European workers. Its concerns were essentially that it was unconcerned largely with organising Africans, and particularly organising Africans in the rural areas and without an African leadership. So that changed completely as a result of the policies which were adopted. There were also, as I've mentioned, significant influences on parties in Cuba, in Brazil. Of course, for a time there was development of the party in Haiti as well. And there were communist organisations established in Senegal, in Martinique, and elsewhere. The general influence of communism amongst people of African origin, whether in the continent or outside it, was probably extremely significant. Even when people either were not members of communist parties or in fact even were unsympathetic or left the communist movement, as in the case of George Padmore. But the influence is extremely broad. If we think of various individuals, for example, Padmore would be one, Césaire would be another, we can see that there is a broad influence. And again, we can talk about various cultural figures in the US, in France, in Britain, and in many countries. So the influence is rather interesting and occurs in strange ways. In Britain in 1945, for example, long after the demise of the Communist International, there is what's considered to be the most significant of all Pan-African congresses, the Manchester Pan-African Congress. The orientation of that Congress we can see flowing out of the earlier conference that was organised in Hamburg in 1930, with its concentration on workers, organisation of workers, with its uncompromising opposition to imperialism, international capitalism, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a significant influence and impact, despite the difficulties, weaknesses, and so on of various communist parties. And I think that it's perhaps one facet of the Comintern's activity that has been overlooked or perhaps even misunderstood in the past. And I hope that, I know there are not only myself but other people who are writing and working on this area, so I hope that in the future it will be better known and hopefully better appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Hakim, Adi. Now we have time for discussion. I'd like to open the discussion with a question. You have been drawing a fact, in fact, a rather